Ken McGoogan's Fatal Passage, the untold story of John Ray, the Arctic adventurer who discovered the fate of Franklin. Part 1. The Truth of Discovery. A Wild Life in Rupert's Land. In June 1833, in the rugged Orkney Islands of northern Scotland, a restless, energetic young ship's doctor stood on the deck of a weather-beaten fur-trading vessel as it sailed out of Stromness harbor. Watching the trawlers, pilot boats, and white-sailed pleasure craft of his youth recede into the distance, a wiry, broad-shouldered man of middle height exulted in the salty breeze. At last, he was bound for Rupert's Land, the vast wilderness empire ruled by the Hudson's Bay Company. Two of his brothers had already sailed with the Hudson's Bay Company, and finally his own turn had come. Since boyhood, Ray had dreamed of exploring North America. The lakes and rushing rivers, the forests filled with dangerous animals. His father, who managed tenant farmers for a Scottish nobleman, also served as an agent of the Hudson's Bay Company, recruiting Orkney men and sending them west. Those men, and others who preceded them, from these rolling, windswept islands, had kept the British fur trade thriving since early in the 18th century. Hundreds of them had sailed to Rupert's Land, and now they made up 3/4 of the staff in the territory. Over time, they had earned a reputation as loyal, hard-working employees, sober, obedient, and capable of enduring unusual cold, hunger, and hardship. 2 months earlier, the 19-year-old Ray had graduated from medical school in Edinburgh. For 4 winters, he had attended Edinburgh University, which had the reputation, in London, of being a hotbed of radical dissent. Having discovered that by transferring to the Royal College of Surgeons, he could receive his diploma without waiting until he was 20, Ray had promptly made the switch. The 4 winters he spent in Edinburgh, a bustling city of 160,000, he later described as uneventful. Steady, plodding through the various courses of study considered at that time requisite before going up for a surgeon's diploma. The young man visited London at least once, but apart from snowball fights between students and town lads, Ray would find little to remember from his Edinburgh years. In April 1833, after passing an extensive oral examination, he had qualified as a licensed for the Royal College of Surgeons. Then adventure beckoned. Ray was young, after all, and this was the age of exploration. Since 1816, when the end of the Napoleonic Wars had created a lasting peace, British explorers had been roaming the globe, filling in blanks on the charts and atlases of the day, bent on discovering not only the Northwest Passage, but also, in the heart of darkest Africa, Timbuktu and the mouth of River Niger. Instead of becoming a small-town doctor in Orkney, or even beginning a practice in Edinburgh, Ray would join the Hudson's Bay Company as a ship's surgeon, at least for a season, to see whether he liked it. All his life, he had watched the company supply ships, 2 or 3 each year, that visited Stromness as their final port call before crossing the Atlantic. They came to stock up on fresh vegetables and to draw water from Logan's Well in the heart of town, just as they had since the 17th century. Ray had grown up hearing a cannon signal the arrival of each supply ship, and relishing the excitement at the docks as sailors streamed out on the vessels to enjoy the final leave before crossing the ocean. Since 1819, Ray's father had been the Hudson's Bay Company's chief representative in Orkney. He recruited tradesmen, clerks, and tenant farmers for the trading posts of Rupert's Land, offering them twice the wage of agricultural laborer could earn at home in Orkney. John Ray, Sr., had previously secured clerical postings for 2 of Ray's older brothers, William in 1827 and Richard in 1830, and it was he who received the letter appointing his son Jock surgeon of the Prince of Wales. In June 1833, the three-masted vessel entered the choppy gray waters of Ahoy Sound and swung to starboard, and John Ray stood enjoying the stiff breeze and the spray of salt air. He watched Stromness recede into the distance to the music of creaking masts, creaking halyards, and snapping sails. The young man never once imagined that 14 years would elapse before he would again see these shores. Legendary sailors had departed from Stromness before him. Henry Hudson, James Cook, Edward Peary. 12 years from now, one of the most famous of them all would stand on a deck, not unlike this one, on the HMS Erebus, and gaze out at the same rocky coastline as he sailed to seek the Northwest Passage. But John Ray couldn't know that. Nor could he know that Sir John Franklin's departure would reverberate through the once of time like an earthquake, generating a tidal wave of catastrophe that would change his own life forever. Ray was fascinated by sailing vessels of all kinds, and he had thoroughly investigated this 60-year-old 400-ton bark, which was one of two supply ships. The other was the Prince Rupert's making its annual voyage to Hudson's Bay. Its foremost and mainmast sails were square-rigged. Its mizzenmast sails fore and arch-rigged. And it carried a full complement of lifeboats. The broad-beamed ship had rounded sides built on solid oak 5 to 7 feet thick, and its bow had been reinforced with iron bars against the pack ice. Bound for Moose Factory, the second largest of all Hudson's Bay Company ports, the Prince of Wales, was packed to the gunwales with provisions and trade goods, everything from nails, muskets, flints, saws, and sealing wax to beads, fish hooks, knives, kettles, and axe heads. Great quantities of food had been carefully stored, including salt beef and pork, cheese, flour, oatmeal, peas, biscuits, malt, vinegar, raisins, butter, lemons, and spices, along with a notably supply of alcohol, cases of wine, rum, and French brandy from the chief factor of Moose Factory, and for the majority of men, English brandy, really cheap London gin colored with molasses. As a medical man who understood the need for fresh meat, Ray also noted this approval in his journal that the ship carried several coops filled with a variety of poultry for the cabin mess. In the long boat, 6 sheep, and there was a pen of 5 young pigs forward. Besides this miscellaneous cargo, the ship carried several passengers in the cabin aft, and another 35 or 40 in the 'tween decks forward. Those in cabins, including Ray, enjoyed civilized meals with the captain and his officers, fresh trout and poultry, followed by the finest French wines. The steerage passengers, who ate mainly salt beef and pork, included 31 men from Orkney, the largest number in a decade to leave those northern islands. Crowded into a stinking, unventilated space not more than 5 feet high, these men slept in hammocks and rough wooden berths that lined the walls, their baggage piled around them. From the outset, Ray worried about these conditions. Some of the men suffered seasickness, rendering their normally fetid quarters more wretched still. Worse, shortly after leaving Orkney, typhoid fever broke out amongst the steering passengers, and many became seriously ill. For 2 weeks, the anxious, inexperienced doctor spent most of his time, day and night, below decks, ministering to the sick. Later, with characteristics understatement, he wrote, "Fortunately, they were all strong, and a healthy lot of young fellows, and recovered very rapidly." When he wasn't tending the sick, the nimble, irrepressible Ray explored the rigging. He badgered sailors and officers to teach him the name and use of every rope, block, and stick on the ship, and to train him to tie various knots and splices, knowledge he would later put to good use. Early in July, after crossing the North Atlantic and passing south of Greenland, the Prince of Wales entered the Hudson Strait. Here, south of Baffin Island, and the only entrance to Hudson Bay, Ray encountered Arctic seas. He saw his first icebergs and marveled at their grandeur, their beauty and purity, vastness and variety, often larger even than the ships, with miniature cataracts flowing from their peaks. They sparkled white and green in the sunlight. Some boasted so many columns, arches, and spires that they resembled glorious cathedrals. Ray felt that he would never tire of standing on deck while the ship threaded its way through the serpentine canals that opened among them. But then, the canals narrowed and disappeared. The pack ice grew thicker and finally halted all progress, and the young doctor found his pleasure in observation waning while the Prince of Wales sat for days in the same spot. For 2 weeks, a mile and a half apart, the Hudson's Bay Company's ships remained beset. The ice was so thick and firm that passengers, among them 2 English ladies, walked back and forth to visit, enjoying the novelty and welcoming the chance to stretch their legs on something other than the deck. The enterprising Ray climbed the mainmast of the Prince of Wales and declared that he would not find a single pool of open water. When at last the ice broke up thanks to a rising wind, dozens of Inuits arrived at the ships in kayaks, proclaiming friendship even from a distance. "Chimo, chimo, friends!" Ray judged that these Baffin Islanders to be harmless and good-natured, though noisy. They traded seal oil and walrus tusk ivory for knives, files, axe heads, needles, beads, and hoop iron, all items brought for this purpose. After finally navigating Hudson Strait and entering the bay, the 2 ships separated, each making for a different Hudson's Bay Company fort, or factory, so named to indicate the presence of a chief, agent, or factor. The Prince Rupert crossed the bay to York Factory, the largest and most important of the Hudson's Bay Company's fur trading posts, while the Prince of Wales, with John Ray aboard, sailed 870 miles south to James Bay and Moose Factory, which was located on an island in the Moose River. The ship arrived on September 7th, 1833, roughly 2 weeks late, and put in a ship's hole, an anchorage 7 miles out from the fort, passable only at high tide. This late arrival meant a rush even more desperate than usual. Small boats ferried back and forth night and day, unloading cargo and stowing furs for the return voyage, now threatened by the onset of winter. On shore, Ray encountered Hudson's Bay Company officers sporting vests, jackets, and even 3-piece suits. The company's rough and ready laborers looked better adapted to the rugged environment. Ray admired the panache of French-speaking voyageurs, decked out in calf-high moccasins, hooded frock coats, tall hats, and colorful sashes, and he secretly envied the deerskin outfits of the natives, who served the fur trade using rivers as highways to transport a kind of gold from the animal-rich wilderness around the bay. When he saw an opportunity, Ray stepped forward to lend a hand. The chief factor at Moose Factory, John Jord McTavish, noticed the young man's energy and wide-eyed enthusiasm and invited him to remain at the post as a doctor. Tempted, Ray nevertheless demurred. His friends and family expected him home, especially his mother. McTavish also presented the young doctor with an Indian birchbark canoe for performing some notable medical service. Ray had little opportunity to test his intriguing craft. However, on September 24th, just 17 days after arriving, he boarded the Prince of Wales and sailed home. At the entrance of Hudson Strait, between Southampton Islands and Point Wolstenholme, the ship encountered a sailor's Arctic nightmare, a barrier of pack ice. For several days, the Prince Rupert had been exploring the ice edge without finding any opening. Now, John Ray stood on deck, watching as the captains of the two sturdy-hulled ships tried repeatedly to breach the ice wall to no avail. Finally, bitterly disappointed, not least because they would forego their bonuses for making a single season passage, the captains turned their ships around. York Factory was overburdened and undersupplied, so the Prince Rupert made for the more northernly Churchill. 350 miles went across the bay. That small outpost would not be able to sustain more than a single crew of unexpected visitors, however. So the Prince of Wales, with 2 feet of ice on her foredeck and a great deal more clinging to her bows, made for Charlton Island at the bottom of the bay, 800 miles away. As the old ship beat south, driven by fierce gales, Ray observed that every rope on our standing rigging was so thickly coated with ice as to be 2 or 3 times its natural size. The sea washing over our forecastle was frozen there to the depth of 2 feet, which together with the ice clinging to our bows set us down 2 or 3 feet by the head, and made the ship for a time most difficult to steer. Charlton Island, an inhospitable depot 17 miles north of Moose Factory, remained accessible, unlike Moose Factory itself, despite the lateness of the season and the encroaching ice. The Prince of Wales had wintered there as recently as 1830 to 1831, but the post had since been abandoned. Ray and his 30 or so fellow voyagers found the ground covered in deep snow, the woods almost empty of animals. After exploring the dreary scattering of tumble-down log and frame houses, most without windows and roofs, the new arrivals erected an immense tent using sails and spars from the ship and trees from the surrounding forests. Here, they stored the ship's cargo of furs, mainly beaver and muskrat, but also bear, lynx, marten, mink, fisher, otter, wolf, wolverine, and various kinds of foxes, silver, cross, red, and white. After beaching the ship, the men set to work repairing the ramshackle houses, using clay to plaster the seams, though already temperatures were so low that the mud froze and cracked. The captain sent a lifeboat to Moose Factory with news that the ship's crew was wintering over with 2 paying passengers who had been returning to England. The boat came back carrying salted geese, blankets, warm clothing, and moose hide for moccasins, and the men settled in happily into their cramped quarters. John Ray met the change of plans with equanimity, even pleasure. "Personally, I enjoyed the situation immensely," he would write, citing the novelty of the experience and the idea of having abundant fine, dry snow on which to go snowshoeing, though initially he was skeptical of the footwear. The lure of haunting unfamiliar game also enticed him, and he started with geese and wild duck. This adventuring he found extremely attractive, a feeling which was not altogether shared by the older portion of our party. During the cold, hard winter that ensued, the young doctor would have ample opportunity to discover how well equipped he was to cope with this erotic ferocity of Rupert's Land. His outdoorsy youth in Orkney had prepared him to flourish in just such an environment, to overcome challenges that would kill men who were less well suited. And on this occasion, flourish he would. The rocky, windswept islands of Orkney lie, as poet and native son George Mackay Brown would have said it, like sleeping whales beside an ocean of time. Dotted with Neolithic remains dating back over 5,500 years, including stone houses completed with shelving units and linked by covered passages. These 74 islands presented an atmosphere of palpable antiquity. The roughly 20,500 people here, unique to the British Isles, are strongly connected to Norway in France by history, through a Norse conquest over 1,000 years ago, and heritage through the families of the Yards and Urals. This singular history, according to Peter St. John, the current Earl of Orkney, has produced a rational, independent citizenry that is equalitarian in outlook and perfectly at home abroad. Located off the north shore of Scotland, which annexed the islands in 1472, Orkney lies almost directly east of the southern tip of Greenland and the entrance to Davis Strait. This meant that early voyagers, lacking the instrumentation to calculate the longitude, would simply sail due west from Stromness. The Vikings had discovered a great natural harbor there during the first millennium. Whalers, sealers, explorers, fur traders. Stromness eventually served them all. Late in the 16th century, while seeking the Northwest Passage, the buccaneer explorer Martin Frobisher put in many times at Stromness early in the 17th century. Henry Hudson watered at Logan's Well before embarking on his final tragic voyage. By 1816, Stromness was supplying fresh water to more than 34 whalers each year. Early in the 18th century, fur trading ships from the Hudson's Bay Company, already in the habit of stopping for water and food, began recruiting Orcadians to serve in the fur trade posts of Rupert's Land. These new employees proved to not only be hardy, industrious, and egalitarian, but also remarkably adept as fishermen and boatmen. Between 1772 and 1800s, while it was gradually taking greater control of its empire, the Hudson's Bay Company expanded its labor force from 180 to just under 600, fully 3/4 of whom were Orcadians. The first Hudson's Bay Company surveyor, an Englishman named Philip Turner, described the Orcadians as a set of the best men I ever saw together, as they were obliging, hardy, and good canoemen. Most could also read and write, while other Scots and English boys often could not. And so they made excellent keepers of journals and records. The Orcadians also impressed the Cree and the Chippewan, whose languages they often mastered and with whom they freely intermarried. Stromness, population 2,200, which perches on Hamnavo, or Haven Bay, and overlooks the natural harbor of Scapa Flow, can today be reached with relative ease. Visitors can travel north from Edinburgh by train or road to the tiny port of Scapster, and there catch the ultra-modern ferry. The St. Ola, for example, accommodates 500 passengers and 180 vehicles, and can make its way to Stromness even through heavy seas in 2.5 hours. Or, visitors can fly into the bustling Orkney capital of Kirkwall, population 7,500, less than 15 miles away, and reach Stromness over a winding 2-lane highway. For John Ray, growing up here early in the 19th century, traveling was more difficult. Even in 1830, when he was 17, the only way to journey between Orkney and the Scottish mainland was by sailing packet. During the stormy winter months, these small vessels would be forced to take a roundabout route and would often require several weeks to make the passage. The only alternative was to risk one's life crossing the treacherous Pentland Firth in the tiny open boat that carried the mails. Far more accessible than it once was, the Stromness that Ray knew remains everywhere in evidence in today's cozy, salty-aired warren of stone buildings and narrow, winding flagstone streets. From many vantage points in town, a contemporary visitor can see Ray's boyhood home, the Hall of Celestrin, 2.5 miles across the Bay of Ireland. Originally a laird's dwelling, this impressive stone mansion, now in considerable disrepair, stands alone on a hill looking out over rolling fields and rough waters. John Ray was born on September 30th, 1813, in this dwelling, as the 6th child, there would be 3 more, and 4th son of John Ray, Sir, a ferry looper, or newcomer who had arrived from Lanarkshire, south of Glasgow. a driving self-made man whose gravestone would identify him as Esquire of Wire Island. Ray's father served as a factor or land agent to Sir William Honeyman, Lord Armadale, one of the most powerful men in northern Scotland. In Orkney, where most families eked out a living on the land, the gentrified Rays were sufficiently prominent that in 1814, while researching his novel, The Pirate, Sir Walter Scott came calling in a lighthouse yacht. Eventually, he modeled two characters, Brenda and Mina, after Ray's two older sisters. "I was very young at the time," Ray wrote later, "but the great unknown took early lunch and got mounts to ride over the stones of Stennis, an ancient archaeological site, and the Cathedral of Kirkwall, often 14 miles distant." In his diary, after admiring the well-cultivated farm and the excellent breed of horses that the factory was breeding, strong, hardy Galloways fit for labor and hacks, Scott mentioned that Ray's father was responsible for 300 tenant farmers, the vast majority of whom lived in small windowless, dirt-floor dwellings of stone and turf. The menfolk fished and hunted whales, seals, birds, and small game, grew barley and potatoes, and kept cattle and sheep, yet they still battled frequent food shortages. From birth, then, the explorer-to-be was set apart. But young Ray showed no sign of feeling superior, reveling instead in the same pursuits of the sons of tenant farmers, a solitary youth who thrived on physical challenge. Ray enjoyed fishing, hiking, riding, shooting, rock scrambling, cliff climbing, and boating in rough waters. He hunted birds on the water and in swamps, seals that turn up on the nearby rocks, and, most exciting and rarest of all, the occasional whale that strayed into Hoy Sound. John Ray Sir provided his sons with two excellent boats, on condition that they maintained them in pristine shape. One was small, light, and handy for fishing, and served as a tender. To the others, an 18-foot yawl called the Brenda, rigged with a jib, foresail, mainsail, and mizzen or jigger. She was both fast and safe. As the fourth oldest brother, Ray started sailing at the jib sheet and worked his way aft. The Brenda could be hard to handle in the sudden squalls that are so frequently in Orkney, but Ray found that when he took her out alone in bad weather, the boat worked beautifully under the reefed foresail and small rigger aft. Ray and his brothers were wildly proud of the Brenda, which could outrun almost anything of her own size. To take the boat neatly through high tides in half a gale of wind gave us a fancy about the same amount of pleasure as a good rider mounted on a favorite horse feels in crossing a difficult country with a lot of bad jumps over water, wall, and fence. Ray sailed through snow, sleet, and gale-force winds. He thought nothing of enduring wet and cold all day, and never dreamed of donning a waterproof coat. The Ray brothers not only raced against town boys from Stromness, but also competed with men sailing pilot boats, which were longer and built for speed. There was tremendous rivalry between us boys and these brave and experienced boatmen. We had no chance with them in fine weather, but whenever it blew hard and the sea was especially rough, we never lost an opportunity of racing, and generally went ahead much to the chagrin of our big opponents and to the gratification of the boys. Before Ray reached his teens, his father gave him an old flintlock that he could hardly lift. The boy made holes at carefully chosen points in the stone wall that circulated the farm, and, using these apertures as gun rests, began hunting heron, curlews, wild ducks, golden plover, and other small game. He found an excellent grouse moor within a 5-minute run of the house. After school hours and during holidays, he would scamper off with his musket and dog, a pointer named Carlo, returning later to add 2 or 3 braces of grouse to the family larder. By the age of 15, Ray had become an excellent hunter, rock climber, and hiker. He often swung home across the moors, carrying a hefty load of game on his back and waving proudly to anyone he met. Later, the youth would beam when the family sat down at the great, long wooden table to eat a dinner that he had provided. His father, stern and preoccupied, would say grace, and then his mother, refined and gracious, would watch carefully from the opposite end of the table to see that the smallest children, scattered among the hungry teenagers and young adults, received their fair share of food. As the credulous 6th child in a high-spirited family, Ray had to endure more than the usual amount of teasing, though often his mother would leap to his defense. I have mentioned sensitiveness and credulity as 2 of my many weak points, the latter, I think, being extensive, because I cannot imagine or understand anyone telling an untruth, more especially for no other apparent reason than the reason of a laugh. I was therefore constantly being hoaxed. John Ray, like his siblings, received a private education. A resident governess made way to a succession of live-in tutors, one of whom kept pet eagles, which demanded a steady supply of small birds for food, birds the boy was happy to provide. Later, Ray would regret never having had the advantage of attending a grammar school and of studying among the other young people. But he contrived to learn enough that at age 16, avid to escape into the wider world, he traveled south to Edinburgh to begin training as a doctor. 19th century sailors who visited the shores of Hudson's Bay, from the captains to the lowliest cabin boys, felt superior to those who lived ashore and detested having to do so themselves. In the autumn of 1833, experienced hands also knew the winter at Charlton Islands would bring short days, freezing cold, howling gales, and fierce blizzards. Above all, they feared scurvy, long the scourge of maritime expeditions. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, the disease was not yet understood, though its symptoms were all too familiar: loose teeth, blackened gums, stiff joints, internal bleeding, and, if not treated, an extremely painful death. As the winter dragged on into 1834, most of the marooned men spent their time sheltering in the drafty cabins, wrapped in furs and huddled around large iron, wood-burning stoves. Without fresh fruits and vegetables, they survived on biscuits and salt meat. Ray used his hunting skills to supply what fresh game he could. Before long, 30 men ran out of lemon juice, and half of them began showing symptoms of scurvy. Ray drew on his medical training to comfort the men and combat the baffling disease as best he could. Decades before its discovery, he deducted the existence of vitamin C. Later, he reported, "I consider scurvy a blood disease caused by the lack of something that it gets from vegetables, and that when you have no vegetables or no bread, there is something that the system wants, which is in very small quantities in animal food, and therefore you have to eat a very great deal more than you want to get the quantity from meat." Ray tried making spruce beer, a concoction well known to the Hudson's Bay Company men, and mentioned in James Lind's classic medical text, A Treatise of the Scurvy, published in 1753, by boiling spruce branches and adding sugar. He did not find this effective, however, probably because boiling destroys the vitamin C contained in the young spruce shorts. 4 or 5 of the sick men ended up in terrible shape, barely able to crawl about, their limbs swollen and discolored, their gums dark and purple and bleeding, their teeth so loose they could be removed by hand. In fact, one fine humorous fellow named Lethem missed 2 of his teeth one morning and could only account for their disappearance by asserting that, "By Jove, I must have swallowed him, sir. with a grin at the thought of making such use of his own best grinders. Over 40 years later, giving evidence from an Admiralty committee investigating scurvy, Ray would paint a grim picture of how two men, the captain and the first mate, died that winter. The only case that was exceptional was that the captain, but he had, I think, something wrong with his lungs. So far as I can remember, he had oedematous swelling of his legs. I do not think his mouth was affected, but clearly it was scurvy combined with some other disease that he died of. The chief mate died also in the most fearful state that I ever saw. His skin was perfectly black, his mouth black, his saliva was as dark as ink, and the odor from him was so horrible that there was no person could come near him but himself. These two men, I believe, had taken more spirits than were good for them, and consequently it was no wonder they were more affected than the other men. While most of the healthy men, fearing contagion, refused to approach their sick comrades, the unflinching Ray manifested not only an iron constitution, but also, for an untried doctor, singular dedication and resolve. In his unpublished memoir, he noted that poor Mr. Terry, the first mate, died after lingering in a terrible state. His mouth and tongue were black, his saliva as black as night, his limbs all purple, and latterly terrible wasted. The effluvia from his body was so offensive that no one could lift him out or into bed except myself, who was then a young lad of 20, not particularly squeamish. Realizing that some readers might find such a depiction harrowing, Ray added that the graphic details were chiefly intended for medical or surgical brethren, should any of them happen to look at his narrative. Alluding to the cheap English brandy distributed to most Hudson's Bay Company men, he added that he did not know in 1834, as he later learned by experience, that alcohol in any form was injurious in a cold climate. I abstained at that time from drinking my allowance of grog. My associates invariably drank all theirs, not because I thought it distasteful or hurtful, but because I had an idea it might be more useful to others, as liniments or stimulants. Ray himself remained perfectly healthy throughout the winter, with the exception of a toothache that bothered him mainly at night. Early in the spring, as the weather warmed, Ray made soup from the tender sprouts of the vetch, or wild pea. Out snowshoeing near the woods one afternoon, typically alone and searching for these sprouts, he noticed some red-stained snow and thought he had discovered blood. Looking more closely, he realized that he had crushed some cranberries underfoot. The resourceful doctor began gathering them to feed to his scurvy patients, while those who could hobbled to the cranberry grounds. Scurvy responds well to treatment, and soon most of the sick men had recovered. Had the ground on their arrival not been so deeply covered in snow, Ray might have found the cranberries early to prevent much suffering, and perhaps even to save the two men who died. In mid-June 1834, undaunted by the misery of the long winter, the captain and the first mate lay buried in humble graves marked by wooden crosses. Ray unpacked the birch-bark canoe he had received the previous autumn from Chief Factor McTavish. As the ice cleared along the shoreline, he led two companions in a 4-day, 90-mile journey around Charlton Island. For a young man used to boats, traveling by canoe is both exciting and challenging. By the end of the trip, Ray had progressed from novice to journeyman and intended to become a master. In mid-July, the men hurled the Prince of Wales off the beach and restowed the company's furs. Towards the end of the month, just as a forest fire broke out, they sailed south for Moose Factory. There, Ray learned that during the winter, the chief factor had used the Overland Express to Montreal, men traveling mostly on snowshoes, to send letters to his family in Orkney, advising them that he wished to hire and retain the young doctor. The responses, Ray wrote, left me at perfect liberty of choice. McTavish had also communicated with Sir George Simpson, the Hudson's Bay Company governor, who had responded by proposing for Ray a 5-year contract as clerk and surgeon. McTavish reported to Simpson that Ray would agree to remain for only 2 years exclusively as a surgeon, and cannot be prevailed upon to become a counting house clerk, McTavish added. He is a very attentive and pleasant young man, hardy and well adapted to the country. However, he only wishes to feel his way may in time take a notion of remaining. Ray would indeed take such a notion. He would spend the next 10 years at Moose Factory, assuming a variety of duties and responsibilities and mastering the intricacies of the fur trade. On August 12, 1834, however, when from shore he watched the Prince of Wales sail for Orkney without him, carrying letters and tokens for his family, especially for his mother, John Ray knew only that he felt fiercely attracted to the wild sort of life to be found in the Hudson's Bay Company service. At the first major crossroads of his life, he had struck off down the less trodden path, embarking on a singular journey that would make him arguably the greatest Arctic explorer of the century.